I'm very happy to be able to welcome you to this Kreis Noon Lecture. My name is Johannes von Moltke. I'm the acting director of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome my colleague Benjamin Paloff, who will be speaking today about the dissident author Post-Dissidence. Benjamin Paloff is an associate professor at the University of Michigan here, jointly appointed in Slavic languages and literatures and the comparative literature department. He also holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of Michigan and completed his PhD in Slavic languages and literatures at Harvard before being selected for a prestigious postdoctoral fellowship here with the Michigan Society of Fellows. He now serves as the acting director of the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies, which I believe is co-sponsoring this event. Benjamin Paloff is the author of Lost in the Shadow of the Word, Space, Time, and Freedom in Interwar Eastern Europe, which was named the 2018 Best Book in Literary Studies by the American Association of Teachers of Slavic and East European Languages. He has also authored two poetry collections titled And His Orchestra in 2015 and The Politics in 2011. He's translated nearly a dozen books, most recently Dorota Mazłowska's Honey, I Killed the Cats, and has been awarded fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, twice in fact, once in poetry and once for translation, by the US Fulbright programs, the Stanford Humanities Center, and the Penn Heim Translation Fund, among others. I'm going to invite Benjamin Paloff to take over the Zoom screen in a minute, but I want to point you to the chat where Malgosia posted some information about the format of this webinar, which presumably many of you will be familiar with now. We'll have a talk after which, and during which actually, you are warmly invited to submit questions using the Q&A function. I will curate and pitch those questions to Benjamin Paloff after our talk, for which we have until, I guess, 1:20 if we want to use it. So welcome everybody, delighted to know that you're here, even though we can't see you. And welcome Benjamin Paloff. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Johannes, and thank you for all of you who have tuned in for this noon lecture. There are close to 60 of you. Whenever I see that many people attending anything that I'm doing, I feel a strange compulsion to remind them that this is going to be a talk by Benjamin Paloff in case they happen to be in the wrong place. I'm really very pleased to see this many people. But, well, I hope not to disappoint you. I do have one very quick correction, and this is ironically just after about 10 minutes ago telling, not even 10 minutes ago, telling Johannes that I'm allergic to self-promotion. But in fact, my most recent translation is not Dorota Mazłowska's Honey, I Killed the Cats, which came out last fall, but this volume of Semiotic Theory by Yuri Lotman, which just came out a few weeks ago, and which I mentioned I hope not as self-promotion. I'm trying to help Academic Studies Press sell these books and alert those of you who do teach Lotman's semiotic theory that there's this new resource. So a couple of small caveats. What I'm going to present today are remarks that are drawn kind of in condensed form from an article that I'm currently writing, almost finished, about, as the title suggests, the dissident author Post-Dissidence. And I want to stress that when I say post-dissidence, I'm not really referring to post their dissidence, but I'm really talking about what happens when we have a writer who is framed, or writers in this case, who are framed as dissident authors after the cultural memory of dissidence is no longer fully operative within a reading community. While I have some, I'll have some remarks to add to this at the end of the talk. Really, what I'm talking about is the peculiarity, which I remember experiencing quite profoundly early in my teaching career, when I realized that I could no longer simply refer casually to the Cold War, but actually had to have an entire lecture to explain to my undergraduate students what the Cold War was. And that actually has shifted, not only to encompass the Cold War and the post-Soviet 90s, but now, in fact, the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, since my own undergraduates either were born after that date or if they were alive, they certainly have no living memory of that date and those events. So that's really what I'm talking about, is a kind of phase shift that occurs generationally whenever we have older ways of framing a writer that are no longer quite relevant to the new generation of readers. The only other caveat I should add is that I'm in, as you can see, a private residence. This is my basement, and which is where I've been working under the COVID pandemic conditions. And since I teach and my wife teaches in the kitchen, and both of my children are learning in their respective Zoom classrooms, we have 4 Zoom calls going on at any given time. Between that and a rather rambunctious husky who wanders in and out of this space, I apologize if there are any noises or interruptions. So my talk today has a strong polemical position. And I promise, in fact, to deliver that polemical position to you unambiguously, but I'm going to deliver it only after I lay out the basic features of my subject. The subject of the talk is the reception paradigm for writers from Eastern and Central Europe in the West, in particular in the larger Anglophone economies of North America and Europe. I'm thinking of the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Ireland in particular, as well as in France and West Germany. And since the notion of a reception paradigm may be less familiar in some fields than it is in literary studies, I'll take a moment here to gloss the term. In referring to a reception paradigm, I am referring to the critical framework that prefigures and therefore shapes our encounters with a text, generally based on our familiarities with historical, biographical, cultural, and genre information surrounding that text. We already have a useful case in point in the title of my remarks. When an author is presented to us as a dissident, we tend to read their work in the context of political dissidence, a context that includes many people who are not literati. Think of Alexander Sakharov or say Lech Wałęsa, right? But that entails a number of defining traits that are ascribed virtually to anyone who might be called a dissident during the Cold War. Advocacy for individual liberty, especially the right to free expression, open resistance to institutional controls, both those imposed by the state and those practiced by the masses, and a willingness to suffer personal and professional repercussions for one's refusal to conform to the dictates of the hegemonic order. All of these traits pertain to the 4 authors I will discuss somewhat glancingly today. Czesław Miłosz, who spent most of the 1950s as a political refugee in France, a defector, more accurately, before settling in Berkeley, California in 1960. Joseph Brodsky, who was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1972, settling in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and later in New York. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was stripped of his Soviet citizenship in 1974 and settled in rural Vermont in 1976. And Milan Kundera, who began his exile in France in 1975 and was deprived of his Czechoslovak citizenship 4 years later. We could easily add more writers to this list, though in doing so, we would necessarily have to work within the constraints, both inherent and epigenetic, of the reception paradigm of the dissident author in the West. Here, an inherent constraint in curating such a list would be the criterion of exile to capitalist liberal democracies. We could not include, for example, the poet Zbigniew Herbert, who did spend a short time in France and the United States, but otherwise lived in Poland, or the playwright and later politician Václav Havel. Both of them fall easily under the heading dissident, but they also both remained, for the most part, in Poland and Czechoslovakia, respectively. What I'm calling an epigenetic constraint on the paradigm of dissident writer in the West would be one that arises not from an explicit definition. When we say dissident writer in the West is explicit, right? But that rather arises implicitly in the paradigm as it has been historically constituted. And historically, the paradigm of dissident writer in the West has applied almost exclusively to men. So exclusively, in fact, that treating a female author in exile as a dissident writer in the West would demand that the scholar or critic who is doing so account for that incongruity. In introducing my 4 case studies, I have drawn attention to the timing of their exiles to the United States and France, as well as to their exclusively male company, and I've done so advisedly. For all 4 of these writers arrive in the West and then build lives and careers there over decades at a time of intense socio-political debate centered on 2 major human rights issues: the rights of racial minorities, on the one hand, and the rights of women, on the other. And today, these issues are once again at the forefront of public discussion, though differently inflected from what emerged from the activism of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. I should note that what I have in mind here is not just the civil rights movement in the United States, which lasted roughly from the mid-1950s to 1968, but the interconnected events and cultural touchstones that kept the issues of racial and gender justice at the forefront of public consciousness across a generation, and what would make any discussion of the era that does not at least acknowledge these issues hopelessly myopic, if not absurd. Imagine talking about the 60s without talking about racial justice or the sexual revolution. These include, but are not limited to, the movement for equal opportunity in education, culminating in the passage of Title IX legislation in 1972, the Supreme Court's decision in Roe v. Wade, issued in 73, increasing outrage internationally over South African apartheid in the 70s and 80s, outrage that was significantly more pronounced among writers and public intellectuals in the United States than it was among policymakers, I should add. In France, waves of racist violence directed against North Africans in the 1970s, and so on. Today, we are concerned with redressing systemic inequities, those that are hardwired into our psychological responses, social behaviors, and especially in our institutions, and are therefore constantly slipping away into invisibility, into the everyday, often beyond legal prescription or recourse. The disease is evasive, though the symptoms are undeniable: permanent inequality in income, workplace status, and vulnerability to police abuse and incarceration. For the dissident writer from Eastern Europe arriving in the United States or France in the 1960s and 70s, however, the marks of racial and gender injustice were much starker, since they were juridical. Civil rights and feminist activists could not yet lobby for equal justice beyond the law, since they still had to demand laws that recognize their equal status in the first place. Whenever there is a strong resonance between one era and another, as I am positing now between our current moment and the movements for equality and justice from that earlier era, it provides an opportunity for a critical reappraisal of the reception paradigm. Does the frame that served us in understanding a writer or text then continue to serve us now? If so, how? If not, why not? And if the reception paradigm has grown stale, is it because it is no longer relevant to current cultural circumstances? This can happen for all kinds of reasons, not least of which is the valley of irrelevance that even some of the most enduring literary works pass through. Something starts simply to sound too old to speak to us now, yet not old enough to be ageless. And even Shakespeare, during the long 18th century night of his irrelevance, can undergo such a kind of valley? Or is it because the critical technologies that we have constructed in the interim expose the paradigm itself as not merely obsolete, but actually broken from the get-go? And so here we arrive at my argument. The echo between the struggles for racial and gender equality in the post-war period and the reinvigoration of those struggles today provides just such an opportunity for reappraisal. And my argument, and I'm making good finally on my promise to deliver the argument right after that preamble, is that we ought to stop reading, discussing, promoting, and even thinking of authors like Miłosz, Brodsky, Solzhenitsyn, and Kundera through the lens of dissident author in the West. I ask your forbearance with the normativity of that phrasing, though I hope to earn it, both the prescriptiveness of my "we ought to stop" and your patience with it in the time that remains. For I have come to believe that the reception paradigm of the dissident writer in general, and in particular the critical cliché that ascribes that dissident writer what is frequently termed moral authority, is having far-reaching negative consequences for how we read these authors today, for how we present their work to a new generation of readers, and even for how we historicize their contributions to the public culture of their own time. In other words, I am arguing not only that the notion of the Cold War dissident writer as a moral authority is no longer relevant today, but that it distorts their contributions to culture then. It's not just that moral authority is in the wrong now, that in the manner of all cliché, it no longer has the power to move or to illuminate, but that it was never accurate in the first place. Now, I'm sensitive to the fact that I'm treading delicate ground. Miłosz, Brodsky, Solzhenitsyn, Kundera, these are writers who have been deeply meaningful to many of us, myself included, and at times it is their palpable appeal to moral clarity that many of us have found so powerful in their work. And again, I would count myself among those seduced by that perceived clarity. Of course, it is difficult to engage for very long with any body of work, let alone writings as extensive and varied as those left by these four authors, without finding one's initial assumptions devastated by complications and contradictions. This is the very hallmark of the richness that rewards sustained attention, and without which most of us would not bother. And this is certainly the case here. If I were asked to characterize these authors' attention to moral questions, and I will assume the privilege of the speaker and simply pose this question to myself, I would answer, I'm now answering, that it consists not in clarity, but in complication, not in certitude, but in striving. The very notion of moral authority, at least as it is constituted in both the popular press and in academic criticism pertaining to the Cold War dissident in the West, does not allow much room for that striving. We simply do not tend to regard misgivings and ambivalences, let alone those projected through and compounded through literary constructs, as authoritative of anything. These are not tractates or treatises. Even Miłosz's A Treatise on Poetry, which is a long poem, and his A Treatise on Morals are not to be confused with the kind of prescriptive thought that their titles suggest, and which the works themselves very carefully resist. I confess that the meaning of the term moral authority has grown increasingly fuzzy to me over the years. I remember finding it devastatingly attractive when I was a teenager, and I indeed know that it was an essential feature of my attraction to these writers during a formative period of my life. I don't mean that to be at all patronizing. It's simply part of how I'm here. Perhaps as a consequence of the time I've lived since then, perhaps owing instead to how I have spent much of that time, some of it in a doctoral seminar, in fact, called Eastern European Poets in the West, which I think I've been teaching for as long as I've been in Ann Arbor. I'm no longer sure I know what moral authority is really supposed to mean in the context of literature. Moral how? Authority over whom? It now appears to me as a glittering generality. Once again, I must stress that I am not in any way, I'm going to do this a lot by that, I'm not saying this because I know that this is delicate and that these are cherished authors. They are for me as well. But once again, I must stress that I am not in any way questioning the courage and conviction exemplified by each author's resistance to state pressure, not to mention public pressure and peer pressure. I'm not denying the pain of exile or the complexity, there's that word again, of each author's relationship to a native realm or an adopted home. They all write extensively on one, the other, or both. Beyond their exceptional talents and qualities of mind, those things that draw us to any writer or any artist we admire, these writers are individually models of integrity marshaled against tyranny. The critical cliche of moral authority differs, however, from other cliches that seem to become encrusted around Eastern European literature in the West. I'm thinking of cliches like absurdist. It seems like you can't have the least thing out of the ordinary occur in an Eastern European text without having reviewers describe it as absurdist, or Kafkaesque, or surrealist, even when those terms have no real application to the text under discussion. But even when critical terms are misapplied or overplayed, their abuse typically pertains most directly to the system of literature itself. And it is within that system that abuses are corrected, critics and scholars chiding critics and scholars, much as I'm doing now. Moral authority is not like those other critical cliches because it pertains most directly to conduct outside of the system of literature. It doesn't just tell us how to read a given text before us, or how to relate that text to others affixed with the same cliche, but it also directs itself outside of the text, to our lived reality, to our private thoughts and social behaviors. Calling a writer an absurdist places pressure, perhaps an unjustified pressure, on how we read that author. Calling an author a moral authority places pressure on how we live our lives. It also implies that we ourselves do not know how to live, that we looked toward Miłosz or Solzhenitsyn to tell us. And while I'm not going to rehash the details here, the critical cliche of moral authority emerges from a debate that has remained unresolved since the very beginnings of Western literature, namely the question of whether reading or art appreciation has any salutary effect whatsoever on the human capacity for moral thought or action. And despite some powerful contributions to that debate from both sides in the relatively recent past, relative to Plato, certainly, I would point especially to Martha Nussbaum's 1997 book, Poetic Justice, and on the other side of the debate, Joshua Landy's 2012, How to Do Things with Fictions. It is striking how little headway we have made in settling the question over 2.5 millennia. At the least, this should make us suspect that we are in the presence not of a reasonably stable, well-defined principle that we would call moral authority, whose content is accessible to all, but rather in the presence of a near-empty signifier whose vacuity we are reluctant to acknowledge. But let us try to approach the question of the moral authority attached to these writers' legacies from a different direction. Not as a public attribution or marketing gimmick, as it often is, actually, but as something with which the writers themselves are grappling, as the meeting place between personal desire and public good. What might we expect moral authority to demand of the writer in Berkeley in 1968, or in Ann Arbor in 1972? And I suspect that some of you listening to this talk may have strong recollections of that time, whereas I can approach them only as text, with all of the good and bad that come from that strange and definitively human perspective. One might imagine, for example, that someone who is publicly perceived as a champion of freedom and justice might have something important to say about racial segregation, or the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., or perhaps about the work of writers whose writing brought African American histories and experiences into the mainstream of public discourse, writers like James Baldwin, Alex Haley, and Alice Walker. One might expect some comment on racial justice, if not in the United States and France. It is certainly understandable that, frankly, that an intellectual exile might be reserved in his criticism of the country that has given him harbor, though Solzhenitsyn was hardly reserved in his 1978 commencement address at Harvard and at times scathing critique of what he calls moral mediocrity in the United States. Well, if not in the United States and France, then at least in, say, South Africa, perhaps some mention of another moral authority like Nelson Mandela. One might wish for, if not expect, a reflection on second wave feminism, its energetic public discourse, legal wrangling with broad international implications, the failed effort to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. One would be disappointed. None of the writers I've mentioned remark substantially on any of these topics. Not on Dr. King, not on Mandela, not on the cause of racial justice or gender equality. 3 of the writers I've mentioned were honored with the Nobel Prize for Literature: Solzhenitsyn in 1970, Miłosz in 1980, Brodsky in 1987, which makes for a very rare company, rarefied company. Yet the first African-American woman to have received the same honor goes almost entirely unmentioned in their work. One of the very few such mentions, in a 1998 interview that Irena Grudzinska-Gross, whom I saw is watching this. Hi, Irena. That Professor Grudzinska-Gross conducted with Czesław Miłosz. I find what he says actually about Morrison unsettlingly patronizing. The Polish poet half-jokingly credits his wife Carol for having gotten Morrison the prize by praising her novel Beloved to a member of the Swedish Academy. The determined apologist can always find ways to accommodate these lacunae simply by asserting every artist's right to choose their own themes and approaches. We do not fault a historian of Soviet communism for not writing a chapter on colonial America, any more than we lament a plumber's poor carpentry. Surely we cannot criticize the Cold War dissident author for not addressing X when he is writing about Y. But that is very much my point. I'm not criticizing them. I'm criticizing us. The writers write what they write, and we try to apply a critical framework that makes sense of that writing in its own historical context and in each generation of readers in our own. Yet for that critical framework to be effective, the linkages between text and context, whether viewed synchronically or diachronically, have to be consistent. It seems perfectly reasonable to me that a reader turning to a writer who has been valorized as having moral authority or being a moral authority should be able to expect that that writer will speak authoritatively on the most pressing moral issues of his time. And that is expressly what we do not find when we turn to the 4 writers I have named. What we do find, in fact, is a pronounced aloofness from those issues. Now, when I'm referring to these issues, I'm really speaking very much about the issues that were most at the forefront of public discourse in the exilic context. That is not to say that Miłosz doesn't write quite beautifully and powerfully about the moral failings of Central Europe leading up to and during the Second World War. He does. He writes about these things extensively. Or that Kundera does not write about the situation of the individual pursuing a life of freedom in a totalitarian state. He does, extensively. But once they enter the United States, once they enter France, the struggles that are current in those places are essentially, as the title of my talk suggests, someone else's problems, not their problems. They do not adopt them as their own. So we do, as I say, we find this aloofness from those issues, as well as attitudes expressed publicly and privately that simply cannot be accommodated in the dominant reception paradigm at all, and are therefore edited out of the author's Western legacies. In 1948, this is just one example, in 1948, while living in Washington, D.C. and working as a cultural attaché for the Polish Communist government, Miłosz wrote to his dear friend, the novelist Jerzy Andrzejewski, about his living conditions, noting the following. And I have trouble even reading this out loud because just the terms are a little odd for coming out of my own mouth. He wrote to Andrzejewski, regarding the help, I don't know if it's even worth it to keep the black woman. In fact, the more period appropriate would be Negro woman, as I think would be a more appropriate translation, but one that grates against me. The black woman, he said, Murzynka is what it is in Polish. I don't even know if it's worth it to keep the black woman who comes, since you don't get much out of them. Even adult black people are like children. That's what Miłosz writes in 1948. This letter belongs to a body of correspondence that has long been available in Poland, where it has enjoyed multiple editions, but it is invisible to English language audiences who wouldn't necessarily know what to do with it. The same can be said of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's 200 let vmesti, 200 years together, his monumental and controversial 2-volume history of Jewish-Russian relations, which remains largely unknown to English language audiences and has spurred no shortage of debate about Solzhenitsyn's problematic attitude toward Jews. I'm not pointing to these examples to out these cherished authors as racists, nor do I think that they should be canceled for attitudes that later generations find inadequate or disappointing or destructive. I'm perfectly comfortable reading them through their perceived shortcomings. But I'm wholly uncomfortable with a reception paradigm that ascribes moral authority to writers whose thinking on the most vital moral challenges of their time and place proves so inadequate to me. That inadequacy, I believe, stems from a reluctance, or perhaps an inability, to engage the topic of race on Western terms. For Miłosz and Solzhenitsyn, racial difference was not, from here on, even though I'll allude to it just in passing, I don't have time to go into the attitudes of these writers toward the rights of women. They're less than woke, I would say, but we will set that aside. Really, I'm concerned about how they constitute race in their writing, even when they're in their Western exiles. For Miłosz and Solzhenitsyn, racial difference was not as it was constituted in the United States, but as it had been known to them in Poland and Russia. That is, as national difference. Pas de deux, between communities joined in space yet separated by religion, history, and sometimes language, a relationship that is always fraught with recriminations and reprisals. For Kundera, who in France adopted a lifestyle of self-seclusion similar to Solzhenitsyn's in Vermont, race appears as little more than a metaphor. For example, in The Farewell Waltz, that's one of his later Czech novels, Valčík na rozloučenou, 1972, the wealthy American Bertlev derides the Czech doctor Škreta for his dismissive attitude toward physically unattractive women, which Bertlev calls aesthetic racism. Aesthetic racism is almost always a sign of inexperience, Bertlev says. Those who have not made their way far enough into the world of amorous delights judge women only by what can be seen. But those who really know women understand that that the eye reveals only a minute fraction of what a woman can offer us, unquote. Here, race is not a cultural construct employed to disenfranchise, exclude, and oppress large and anonymous segments of a population. It is rather an individual prejudice, significant, like so much in Kundera, only as an impediment on a man's path toward erotic self-actualization. Self-actualization, in fact, is a potent and necessary value to consider when assessing precisely what kind of moral position the dissident writer in the West represents. For it is not, I have been arguing, a stand against systemic injustice. It is rather a stand against the injustices of a system. These are not the same. Systemic injustice is endemic within a culture and at every level of social interaction, irrespective of who is in an authoritative position. It is difficult to see, which is why we are now witnessing the vigorous development of critical discourses, among them critical race theory and intersectional feminism, in order to see them more clearly. The injustice of a particular system, on the other hand, names its perpetrators, the tyrant, the regime, the institution of penal servitude, and provides an obvious remedy: individual liberty, individual rights and responsibilities. In other words, libertarianism, the recognition of each individual's right to say as they please, do as they please, and to be left alone. It is this libertarian ethos that is valorized from the very beginning of the Cold War dissidents' life in the West. Each was lauded as a courageous champion of free expression even before their exiles had begun. This fit a policy-driven, Manichaean narrative that presented the capitalist United States and Western Europe as bastions of freedom, the Eastern Bloc as a pit of oppression and privation. We should recall that in mainstream American and French politics, in the mainstream American and French politics of the 60s and 70s, agitation for civil rights and gender equality were strongly associated with Soviet communism, sometimes legitimately and often spuriously. Foreign writers who aligned themselves publicly with these movements did not receive a warm official reception, whereas writers who adopted a libertarian position advocating not for systemic change, but rather for individual freedom, were not likely to be welcomed. And I can just add as a kind of illustrative example of this is Czesław Miłosz himself, who spent most of the 1950s in France, in large part because he could not enter the United States. He had lived in the United States when he was a cultural attaché of the communist government, and then could not return because he was suspected by the American federal government of being a crypto-communist, still being a communist, effectively, but secretly, kind of in his soul. So what Miłosz does in France in the 1950s, in the early 50s, is he writes The Captive Mind, which then becomes a kind of love letter, if you will. I don't think of it this way, but the U.S. government seems to have thought of it this way, as a kind of love letter to Western liberal democracy. This is what I'm aligning myself with, not with these complex political and cultural calculations that we otherwise think of Miłosz being associated with. And that's what allows him then to assume his professorship at Berkeley. This dynamic could foster some, in fact, curious oddities in public discourse. When a young Joseph Brodsky, then a little-known poet in the Soviet Union and quite unknown outside of it, when he was targeted in a now infamous 1964 show trial, one that was covered widely in the Western press, despite Western readers having literally zero familiarity either with the poet or his poems. He was praised in that press, again, not on the basis of any poems. No one knew what the poems were. But he was praised in the Western press as a beatnik. This was literally the term being used. A beatnik standing up to conservative inflexibility. It is a striking characterization, not only because a college professor who tests his students on how precisely they have memorized their weekly allotment of 100 lines of formal verse doesn't fit the typical mold of beatnik, and that's really that is how Brodsky taught. He imposed terror on his students in this way. But because at the time the trial was reported, the term itself was typically used derisively in the American press. It denoted a shiftless pseudo-artist drifting through the counterculture, while Brodsky's beatnik was a warrior fighting the Soviet hegemon. In this instance, moral authority has nothing to do with a willingness to criticize systemic injustice. Rather, it signals a conservative political position, one that privileges individual agency over collective action. Brodsky appears to say as much, in fact, in 1988 here, not in my basement, but here at the University of Michigan during his commencement address. At all costs, he tells the graduates, try to avoid granting yourself the status of the victim. No matter how abominable your condition may be, try not to blame anything or anybody, history, the state, superiors, race, parents, the phase of the moon, childhood, toilet training, etc., unquote. Anyone, I think, who equates race with the phase of the moon or toilet training when listing those factors that might demand redress has failed fundamentally to comprehend race in the American context. And not only have they failed to comprehend it as it pertains to the current state of our public discourse now, in 2020, statements that are out of date, frankly, can be forgiven for being outdated. My point, however, is that these same statements are already morally inoperable in their own time. They can only be delivered and accepted by those who have already determined not to examine the moral crises of their time and place. In concluding, I wanted to remark briefly on why I find this particular reception paradigm, and specifically the critical cliche of moral authority, so problematic for me in a very practical way, beyond the challenges that really the distortions, I should say, that it imposes on the reading of a very long and complex body of work. It effectively makes it impossible to teach this material persuasively to the next generation of readers. If I simply present Miłosz or Brodsky or Solzhenitsyn, for that matter, as moral authorities to a 20-year-old in the United States today, and if I point out that Miłosz lived the entire 60s in Berkeley, California, and yet had nothing to say on the issues that were surrounding him on that campus all the time, or sometimes he did say something that might be, essentially derisive, as when he famously criticized the student protesters at Berkeley as the spoiled children of the bourgeoisie. It effectively makes these writers unintelligible to the new generation of students. It says that they should be reading these students as having a moral authority that pertains to their actual lives, because that's, as I said, what moral authority implies. And yet the students themselves do not recognize the circumstances in which these writers took their moral stands, the difficulty that they then endured in exile. These things have to be heavily contextualized. And then when they ask, so what did these writers say about the civil rights movement? What did these writers, which pertains most, of course, to Miłosz, because he was here during most of the civil rights movement. But if they then ask, well, what did they say about racial injustice or gender equality in the 70s and 80s? If we then come back and say, or when we then come back and say that, in fact, they don't say much about this, the students become suspicious of this idea of moral authority. It becomes noise to them. It no longer allows them to navigate the complexities and challenges of these writers' own struggle with questions of justice, freedom, and ethics. And in that way, it effectively condemns these same writers to long-term obsolescence. So what I am polemically arguing for is to jettison these categories, to revisit Brodsky as Brodsky himself wanted to be read, in fact, as a poet on his own terms individually, to read Solzhenitsyn as a very important witness, a literary witness, to the injustices of the Soviet Union without extrapolating from that broad conclusions that, in fact, do not apply to the American context where he spent his exile. And that's more or less where I will leave the discussion. I will invite your questions and your outrage, and I hope that that this has been, at the very least, provocative and entertaining. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Benjamin. That's an exciting prospect to respond to a paper on moral authority with moral outrage, but I don't. I doubt that's exactly where we'll go. I will first reiterate that we would welcome your questions in the Q&A. Please feel free to type them in. As Malgosia notes in the chat, it would be helpful if you could briefly identify yourself, just for some context, although we will try to get to your questions even if you don't. I have a number of questions, but I'm going to start with one that's already in the Q&A from Kasia Kydlinska, who early asked whether, when you were talking about the epigenetic constraint on your categories and why it's so difficult to include women in this, and that one would have to justify including women. Kasia Kydlinska asked, could you give some examples of having to account for choosing women to include them in the dissident writer status?
Well, I say epigenetically because I don't think that there's anything inherent in the definition of Eastern European poet in the West or dissident author in the West that would exclude women. It's just that very, very few of these writers were women. And answering the question, I think, persuasively would require its own basically a separate study. Why is it that so many of these writers who were exiled from Eastern and Central Europe, either imposed by the state or chosen freely by themselves, why were so many of them men? And they, of course, Ann Arbor is kind of a locus for this, because a great number of these men passed through this campus. If I can speculate a little bit, because I have been thinking about this, one of the reasons has to do with the socioeconomic status of women in the world in the 60s and 70s, during the Cold War, during the height of the Cold War. If you were a young woman, unmarried, coming from Staten Island to New York City, your chances of survival might have been rather bleak in 1960. So if you were say a woman who didn't speak English, coming from Poland, unmarried, without job prospects, that's an extremely precarious position. Whereas the men I'm talking about came from their original positions, or from their original contexts. They came to the West into careers. Brodsky was tenured at the University of Michigan without having a college degree at all. Miłosz was tenured at Berkeley within months of his arrival. Now, if you compare that to the situation of women in academia even in 2020, that seems quite extraordinary. So imagining that a female poet Brodsky's age could make simply that same leap, it seems socioeconomically suspect. Like, it seems fantastical to me. That's one reason. Another reason seems to have to do with the position of women writing in the context themselves, where many of them simply did not really welcome the public status that came with leading a moral charge. It's not that they didn't lead a moral charge; it's that it's embedded in the work. If you look at Szymborska's writing from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, it has a very strong humanist moral character. But it is not in any way hortatory. It does not call for action. It does not position itself as an authority at all. In fact, it insists on its own humility over and over again, all the way up through her Nobel lecture. In fact, in when she got the Nobel Prize in '96, the theme of that lecture is the importance of acknowledging that you don't know things. That is not a position that really lends itself to promotion as moral authority. So again, I don't think that that's a complete or entirely persuasive answer. I actually do think that it has to. I think that in some ways the position of the dissident writer in the West tends to be heavily male, because it, like so many other avenues for professional advancement and artistic self-expression, were closed to women, or not, at least not as open to women as they were to the men. That's beyond, of course, all of the traditional pressures on women that men simply didn't have to deal with. Brodsky had he had a relationship in the Soviet Union, but men, it's a lot easier, unfortunately, for men to simply pick up and leave. Women have children, women have other relatives they're taking care of. That traditional role as caregivers really does limit some of their ability to take the kinds of risks that the men took in the 60s. Again, that's speculative, but it's an avenue that I would pursue if I were to write on that question in detail, which I may do.
I'm going to take the liberty of following up just on something you said by asking you to run it through your argument, which is whether Szymborska, in that case, is that the right name to answer me? Whether she, therefore, and different from the argument you advanced about the four men, has in any way been or remained more legible without being saddled with the moral authority paradigm than the men?
I think so, actually. I think that criticism, that Western and Polish criticism of Szymborska's work really does focus much more on her work. And it avoids these kind of grand reframings of the poet as having to speak for something beyond her own modest position, which she's always insisting on. This, in fact, created a little bit of friction when she received the Nobel Prize, because for some reason, when it comes to the Nobel Prize in particular, whoever is awarded the prize then sparks a conversation about whether they deserved it, which is very bizarre to me because it's a nice thing. It's an honor. It's not like there is no deserves. Deserves is not part of, these are people who've made important professional contributions to the literature of their time, and they're being honored with a big pile of money. That's very nice. It doesn't mean that there's some kind of ranked list somewhere, and we're just running down the list before they, as long as they're still alive at the time we get to the name. That's not how it works. But there was, nevertheless, a lot of debate. And in fact, this was a kind of hallmark of Nobel Prizes in the 90s whenever they were awarded to women, whether it's Nadine Gordimer in South Africa, or Szymborska in Poland, or Toni Morrison in the United States. It seemed that those were at least in my recollection, those were the awards that sparked the most question about did they deserve it. There was no question generally that the men, even rather obscure writers like Dario Fo in Italy, who still, after the Nobel Prize, he's still not really read in the United States. But there was no question at the time about whether or not his contribution was sufficiently original or powerful to warrant the prize. But when Szymborska won the prize, Miłosz's reaction was quite lukewarm to her receiving the prize. He did not think of her as being someone of world literary import. And it's that in some weird way has actually, I think, allowed for her work to be read more openly with an attention to what her work actually does, as opposed to filtering it through this kind of reception paradigm that says this is what it's supposed to be doing. Does that answer the question?
Very interesting. Yeah. I'm going to take Herb Eagle's question, which is, I'm just going to read it out for you. Would you say that not all dissidents behaved as these four? Filmmakers like Dusan Makaveyev or Agnieszka Holland, for example, who were able to include critiques of racism and gender inequality in the films that they made abroad. And does it say something that such artistic figures were not and are not widely recognized as moral authorities, although their concerns were and are arguably moral?
That's a great question. I think it does make a big difference, and the difference consists in the position of the artist relative to the artwork. Filmmakers are behind the camera. We don't see them. We see the movie, and we recognize the movie as having a strong moral position. But Holland, who just delivered our Copernicus lecture as an interview that Professor von Moltke and I conducted a few weeks ago, I absolutely agree. She's an important dissident filmmaker who has taken strong moral positions from the very beginning of her career, and that's actually one of the things we discussed in detail in that interview. And yet, despite her having worked in multiple film industries across Europe and North America, I would venture to say that very few people who have seen and enjoyed her work are aware that they saw and enjoyed her work. I don't think that people who are fans of, say, The Wire or Treme on HBO think like, oh, wow, that was Agnieszka Holland is making this, even though she was part of those projects. It's different with the author, right? How do we look up an author's work? By their name. We don't look it up typically by the title, right? We're looking for Miłosz work. We're looking for Solzhenitsyn. We're looking for what Miłosz and Solzhenitsyn have to say. Whereas when we're watching a film, Makaveyev is an excellent example as well. He's someone who's actually, like, again, very important filmmaker, very important artist, and influential, and yet behind the camera. I don't think that that's a familiar name to anybody in North America. Whereas if you are a reader of American poetry, you know the names Miłosz, you know the name Brodsky. virtually anyone who's a literary reader in North America knows Solzhenitsyn and Kundera, right? They may not even necessarily be able to name the books, but they can name the author. So it's a very different relationship in the position of the author vis-a-vis the artwork. And I think that makes a big difference. I'm sorry, and I think there was a second part of the question.
Let me see if I can retrieve it here. Yes. Does it say something that such artistic figures were not and are not widely recognized as moral authorities, although their concerns were arguable and moral? I think you answered.
Yeah, I think yeah. At least I tried to.
Yeah, but again, I'm going to take the liberty of following up, particularly based on the interview that we did with Agnieszka Holland, which at one point had us discussing also the level at which she is trying to pitch her work. And I wonder, I mean, the four writers you're talking about, 3 Nobel winners, clearly working to cement their place in the pantheon of world literature, aspiring, working in something that's institutionally and formally defined as high art. Whereas Holland very deliberately, and I love the way she explained this, said, I'm working to find a middle art, between the mass appeal of Hollywood and the rarefied appeal of European auteurism, let's say, where we would identify a film with the name of the filmmaker. So I wonder to what degree cultural hierarchies play into your paradigm.
No, I think that's a very fair question. I would say that when it comes to the paradigm of the dissident Eastern European writer, cultural hierarchies play an extremely important paradigm, because even in postmodern cultural space, that would have us question that hierarchy of values as an imposition, and usually one that is meant to bolster invisible systems of control. That even within postmodern cultural space, the modernist hierarchy of cultural value retained within the paradigm of the Eastern European poet in the West, or the Eastern European dissident writer in the West. That they are welcomed into their new cultures, or into their new cultural contexts, as well. It's in the name. It's not just moral authority, as though they have something to tell us, like, about good and evil that I don't know. That there's some secret. They have some secret esoteric knowledge, and they do this in part through an appeal to their own extensive erudition. And their erudition is not an erudition when it comes to popular culture or even popular discourses, as I've pointed out. They were quite blinkered about what was being discussed in the popular cultures around them, to the point of aloofness. But when we talk about the biographies of someone like Miłosz, Solzhenitsyn, Kundera, Brodsky, I've chosen these examples advisedly, but I think this applies to others as well. What is it that makes them so attractive? A big part of it is that they very casually refer to Nietzsche, that they very casually refer to Swedenborg and Dostoevsky and Viennese secessionism, etc. They in many ways are given licenses to appeal to a modernist hierarchy of cultural value that has become already suspicious. So if an American says it, oh, this person is stodgy, this person is a snob. But if Brodsky says it as someone who's almost entirely autodidact, someone who taught himself this stuff, who taught himself English in order to read John Donne, well, that is something that we valorize, right? So again, it's almost like a bracketed or sequestered cultural paradigm within itself that does not, in fact, adequately refer to the cultural context around it. It's like a little island. And that's part of what we find appealing in it, is that it, in fact, affirms our own snobbishness in being able to pronounce a name like Miłosz or Solzhenitsyn, right? That being a reader of these people, as I said, makes you a literary reader, not a popular reader. So this is something that, in fact, does not quite, again, not to over speculate about an earlier question, but it actually doesn't fit the way that female authors in the same period are largely operating. Someone like Szymborska is really, really interested in kitsch. She plays with it, she talks about it, she enjoys it. And that is not something that Western audiences were initially receptive to.
You've worked your way around to the seg for the next question, which comes from Han Shu, a grad student here at Michigan, who asks whether Olga Tokarczuk will face the same reception paradox in, let's say, decades to come.
That's a really good question, and I don't know. I don't want to speculate too much about the future. I do know about the recent past, and in fact was mentioning this to my Polish literature students just yesterday. That when it comes to like a writer like Dorota Masłowska, whom I've been translating for quite a few years, she herself, as a younger Polish author, so she's a generation younger than Tokarczuk. She has herself experienced the pressure to conform to the Western dissident model, which is utterly absurd in her case because she was born in 1983. The Polish Roundtable talks occurred when she was 6. So she has, in fact, and she's written about this, about the weird thing that happens when she first gained international fame and started, doing conferences and readings and residencies in Germany and in New York, London. She was constantly being asked, what was communism like? And eventually, she says, she just started making things up. She started making up tales of woe because that's what people wanted to hear, right? They were fetishizing a paradigm of the dissident writer, where again, it's the paradigm remains this kind of island that gets imposed on whoever seems like they might fit, which is an utter mismatch in the case of Masłowska. I think it's also, greatly a mismatch in the case of Tokarczuk, whose writing career, she had an earlier career as a psychotherapist, which comes up quite a bit in her work. But her literary career is really a post-communist literary career. And my expectation is that in 20 years, and she has a lot of years left, one hopes. She's in her 50s, so we expect to read her for time to come. And by in 20 years, when we're still, I think, going to be reading Tokarczuk, most of the people who can only see through the Cold War lens will have faded away from the critical apparatus. So my guess is that we are not going to be constantly rehashing this same thing. I would say the argument here is that we should have probably stopped some time ago, and yet I was triggered in this. I was going to do a slide thing instead of just reading to you, and then I had the slides were just words, and I don't like doing that, where it's just people reading words that I'm speaking. But I thought about doing a kind of, whenever I'm talking about a critical cliche, I always feel this weird pressure to substantiate the cliche, that it's really a cliche. So I had a bunch of quotes where critics, both popular reviewers as well as scholars, are referring to the moral authority of each of these writers. And it just got to the point where it was absurd. The slide was just, it was over and over and over again, one after another, as recently as 2 weeks ago. I think in the New Yorker magazine, referring to the moral, these writers as writers of moral authority. And I just could not understand why it's like a zombie. It just doesn't go away. It always comes back. But it's only in reference to these writers. And I don't think that it's something that's going to come up with Tokarczuk, because her writing style is very, very different from these writers. In fact, is quite a challenge to distill any clear moral messaging in her work, even though she has very, very strong opinions that she shares publicly about again the current issues of her own social and political context. She talks a lot about animal rights, women's rights, the rights of gender minorities. These are issues of current debate. And my expectation is that will be part of how we frame her going forward. But it'll time will tell. I don't think that we will be kind of inserting the writers of 2020 back into the paradigm from 1968, 70, etc. But I would rather that we simply eliminate the paradigm altogether.
But perhaps if the moral authority paradigm is shifting or needs to shift, this might be overstating your argument, but you're keeping the dissident paradigm unvarying, right? It's communist, it's anti-communist dissidence, and perhaps what we also need to start thinking is that writers who come after communism can still be dissident in certain ways. Right. That we just need to start learning to read in new ways. So that also starts to shift the idea of dissidence itself.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a very interesting, I think that's an excellent point, because if you take a writer like Ta-Nehisi Coates, for example, whose writing is insistently in sharp critique of the systemic injustice in this country, isn't it rather curious that we don't refer to him as a dissident writer? Because he is every bit. What's that?
Because we live in a free society.
Well, that's the thing. So why is it that if you actually, when we examine, if you take of all of the writers that I've mentioned, Brodsky is the least overtly political. In fact, he is the most libertarian in his ethos of simply wanting to write poems, and the poems are not mostly not overtly political. You find these little jabs at authority or little jabs at bureaucratism. But for the most part, his poems are personal, and they appeal to intimacies. He comes over to the United States as a dissident writer, and then you take an American author today who writes insistently on issues or on themes that are critical of American society, and yet we don't think of him as a dissident. Right. That whenever we can point to these kinds of disjunctions, it should be alerting us as scholars, and I think many of the people in this call are scholars. It alerts us in some sense to unfinished work within our own authority and our own responsibility, is to correct something that's simply a characterization or a representation that simply does not jibe with reality. We have the one author who doesn't write much on politics, but he's a dissident because we want to see him that way. And then we have the other author who would only be, in fact, more energized and more potentially dangerous to mainstream hegemonies if we were to acknowledge him as a dissident at all. And that's the problem.
I don't see any further questions in the Q&A. Although here's a couple more. Okay, I'll take these two. I was going to say we can also close. I'll take these two more questions and then we'll close after those. One from Kristina Zamorska, who asks, there's a problem here with presentism and Western consumption as an interpretive context. Moral authority and the dissident writer are both Anglophone creations. Mm-hmm. Who are globalizing experiences which happened generations before.
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm globalizing experiences. I'm saying that these experiences were globalized. I mean, I received these authors as a teenager. I was in my teens when I started reading all of these authors that I've mentioned. This is how they were presented to me in the 1990s. Right? It is how a very prominent critic in the New Yorker I just mentioned described these authors, or at least one of them, just 2 weeks ago. Right? It's like I say, it's a zombie concept. I thought, in fact, and I apologize if I was unclear, but my point was very much that this was a Western construct that was then universalized. And not just universalized spatially so that it becomes an imposition on writers who have no real association with the Cold War context, but temporally, that it continues to be how we have to view these authors to the absurd extent that Western readers look to someone like Masłowska for what she can tell us about the Cold War. Which is bonkers, right? So I don't mean to. I'm hopeful that I didn't misrepresent my own position. I'm not globalizing or universalizing this at all. I'm asking us to stop.
Mm-hmm. And Kasia Kidlinska picks up on the conversation we just had, asking whether the concept of a dissident isn't related to the existence of strict censorship. So the Ta-Nehisi Coates example, are we essentially, is it a category mistake to even think about him as a dissident writer in a society that doesn't exercise strict censorship?
I think that is a little bit too cut and dry. We do have a tendency to assume that that writers whom we now associate with dissidents were all censored, or for that matter, that writers whom we don't think of as dissidents are not censored. Neither one of these things is true. I've long wondered. So, for example, this has been a kind of devil's advocate question that has buzzed around my mind for quite some time. If we were to imagine that Brodsky had come to the United States, still a fairly young man, and had not been immediately befriended by W.H. Auden, made poet in residence at the University of Michigan, then given a teaching position in New York, and then a permanent position in Ann Arbor. Let's imagine that he's just like any of the other poets around the world who would love to have that same set of opportunities. The question is, would Brodsky have been afforded a living, a profession, professional standing, global fame, if he had not had been the subject of the show trial in 1964? I'm doubtful, frankly. And by the same token, remember those of you who are familiar with that trial may remember that the accusation was that he was guilty of social parasitism, that he was essentially living off the Soviet system without providing the labor that was required of him. And that, of course, was understandably raised as a grave injustice against an individual. Well, I can't make a living as a poet. I know lots of poets who simply cannot publish. There's no room in the marketplace for them. There's no guarantee that they can make a living in their chosen field. Does that make them dissidents? Does that make them censored? Capitalism is itself a system of censorship, right? So I don't think that it works quite that way. There were times when dissident writers could publish freely, or relatively freely. There were times when those conditions changed. The same is true in a capitalist system. And the consequences for missteps can be severe in both systems. I'm not saying, of course, that the United States is like the Soviet Union. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I am saying is that it's rather simplistic of us to assume that, American writers are free and they can make a living as they choose, and that the writers in the Soviet Union are under the thumb of the tyrant and they can only make a living if they conform. Conformity is absolutely demanded by a capitalist system.
I'm going to although I said we were going to close the list, I'm going to let Howard Ford, because he asked the question that comes at the same question another way. Mm-hmm. So just to throw it in, asking, would you compare blacklisted American directors and writers to the four dissidents that you discuss? In other words, there is a practice also under capitalism in free societies of blacklisting.
Sure. I mean, I think we can compare anything. Now, what emerges from that comparison is a different issue. The situation of filmmakers whose careers had been effectively destroyed by McCarthyism is not particularly dissimilar from the situation of Soviet writers whose careers were likewise destroyed by their I want to make a clear distinction between people who were the victims of state violence and people who simply were not allowed to publish. Zbigniew Herbert is a Polish poet who comes to mind as a poet who is sometimes allowed to publish and sometimes not, and when not, who is reduced to a basically starvation-level poverty. But I can find starvation-level poverty among artists in the United States quite easily. Right. So it's one of these things where, in fact, it's not. I don't think that we can simply attach these labels and assume that everything that comes with the label is consistently embodied by the writer or the filmmaker. I know that's a dissatisfying answer to the question, but really, I'm trying to make an argument against monolithic reception paradigms altogether. I find them distorting and limiting in a way that effectively condemns these writers to obsolescence once the paradigm itself no longer seems current.
All right, I think we're going to leave it there. That seems like a fitting summation of your argument. There are more questions. I have more thoughts on this. This is a lot of food for thought. Great for a lunch lecture. Thank you, Benjamin Paloff, for sharing your work and your thinking on these important issues. And let me just say that we'll have one more noon lecture when we come back after the Thanksgiving break, which will be on December 2nd, when we'll be doing a kind of experimental, exploratory session that we're calling Curating COVID, where we'll be looking at the material and visual cultures of the pandemic and trying to ask, with the help of speakers from the Soviet Union, from France, and from the US, to ask whether and how we might already be engaged in creating the archive for the future of our present moment and what that would mean. We have people involved in collecting, people who think about photography, people who work on folklore, and in sociology. It's co-sponsored by Museum Studies and the Humanities Collaboratory, and I'm quite excited about this event and looking forward to some really open-ended discussion on where that will lead us. So we'd love to see you for that. And I'll also say, just to put it on people's radars, especially if you are multipliers in this sense, that the MIRS, the Masters in International and Regional Studies MA, is accepting applications, of which CREASE is a part. And if you know people who you'd like to encourage, the deadline is December 15th. And with that self-promoting plug, I'm going to close the webinar and thank Benjamin Paloff again. Thanks very much.
Thank you all for your attention.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.